On July 5th of 2004, a 36-year-old man was found brutally murdered inside a Frito Lay Distribution Center. But as for who did it and why, well, that would shock an entire town. This is the case of Michelle Reynolds. Hello, friend, and welcome to High Time Crime. My name's Joel, and on here I specialize in true crime and also job interviews. What are my greatest strengths? Well, I'm pretty good at eating. Does that count? But anyway, today we're going over the case of Michelle Reynolds, a woman whose dark, evil secret led to a terrible atrocity. For our story, we're heading to Rome, Georgia. Rome, Georgia is the largest city of Floyd County with a population of around 37,000 people. The region it's located in is at the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, and it has a great storied history and some beautiful scenery. If you ever find yourself here, there's a decent amount of fun things to partake in. You can visit the Museum of Flight and walk through an entire display of the history of aviation. You could head over to the Downtown Heritage Trail System, a series of long and winding trails perfect for spending some time in nature. You could take a tour through the Martha Berry Museum, the former residence of a woman responsible for providing thousands of poor children opportunities to get an education. You could even stop by the Lazy Creek Farms, a family-owned strawberry and pumpkin farm that offers a corn maze, hay rides, and much more. Help me! But despite how fun all of that sounds, none of these things are the reason as to why we're in Rome, Georgia today. Michelle Reynolds and her husband Thad were, by all appearances, the perfect couple. Growing up, they were high school sweethearts, with Michelle being a popular homecoming queen, while Thad was a football player and equally as popular. After high school, the two of them got married and found jobs, and before long, the perfect couple turned into the perfect family. In 1992, Michelle gave birth to a daughter, and from that point forward, she became a stay-at-home mother as Thad worked his way up the ladder at Frito Lay, which, for those that don't know, is the company that makes Doritos. Yummy. But according to others, Thad was everything Michelle could have asked for in a husband. He was a good father, a loyal Christian, and a very hardworking person. But only 3 years after having their first child, Michelle and Thad's relationship hit a rough patch and they got divorced. Evidently, Michelle was frustrated at being just a stay-at-home mom, and she wanted more than that. Now by then, the two of them were heavily involved in their local church, a place known as Hollywood Baptist. And because Thad was quite religious, he didn't really believe in divorce. So shortly after he and Michelle went through one, he was asking his friends and fellow church attendees to pray for him and Michelle's reconciliation. And miraculously, 2 years later, it worked. In 1997, Thad and Michelle remarried. Then, before long, they had a few more kids, and their relationship was once again going strong. Both Michelle and Thad worked with their church's youth group to set up skits, shows, and various types of performances in different locations. And in the process of doing so, they became close friends with another married couple known as Scott and Paige Harper. Scott Harper was the church's youth minister, while Paige was Scott's wife and a devoted Christian. And part of the reason the two couples got along so well was because they were very similar. Both Thad and Scott were outwardly religious, while Michelle and Paige were stay-at-home mothers. However, despite this friendship duo being so tight-knit at first, within a matter of time, something sinister began festering underneath the surface. By 2004, Thad made the decision to begin the process of trying to become a minister. He felt that it was his God-given mission. Meanwhile, though, his wife Michelle started demonstrating some strange behavior. In June of that year, she signed up to go on a youth retreat with her friends Scott and Paige. What this meant was simply that they would all be chaperones for the kids while they did their activities. But despite initially telling Paige that she was going to room with her in the hotel, Michelle changed her mind at the last minute. Instead, she told Paige that she didn't want to be in a room with a bunch of kids, so she was just going to get a room of her own, meaning that out of all of the adults chaperoning the retreat, Michelle would be the only one with her own room. On top of this, throughout most of the time they were away, Michelle started acting unusually distant around Paige. The two of them were supposed to be good friends, and yet Michelle could hardly look at Paige in her eyes or even speak to her. And when Paige ultimately confronted Michelle about why she was acting this way, Michelle said that it was because she just wanted to be around people who were, quote unquote, on fire for God, essentially implying that Paige wasn't religious enough for her. Naturally, Paige found herself offended by such a comment, but as you'll soon figure out, this was a total load of hypocritical BS. Anyway, after the retreat, people quickly began picking up on the fact that Michelle was trying to spend more time with Paige's husband, Scott. Every chance Michelle got to spend with Scott, she would. And more frequently, she started requesting his assistance for things she probably didn't actually need help for. This mostly included things to do with the kids at the church, but additionally, she was asking him all types of questions and now maintaining a constant correspondence with him over email. To the outside world, it wasn't that big of a deal, but in reality, these conversations were far more than they seemed. Not only were Michelle and Scott engaging in a lustful affair, but they were planning something so evil that it's hard to imagine. On 4th of July weekend of 2004, Michelle Reynolds and her husband Thad spent nearly the entire weekend with Paige and Scott Harper. After first hanging out on Saturday, they got back together on Sunday for church. And then, after that, they all met up again at a local park for a picnic with their kids. Here, they ate snacks and played volleyball and had a bunch of fun. But one thing that Paige Harper couldn't help but notice about Michelle was that she was being openly flirtatious with other men. Now, evidently, this wasn't a big cause for alarm for Michelle's husband Thad, though, because when the picnic was over, they got in their car with the kids and went home as if nothing ever happened. But only a day later, something terrible happened. In the early morning of July 5th of 2004, a Frito Lay delivery driver parked his truck in the empty parking lot of a distribution center. As he was about to exit the vehicle, he saw from the corner of his eye a nervous-looking man leaving the office that he didn't recognize. Whoever this man was frequently peeking over his own shoulder and trying to get out of there as fast as he could. And within a few minutes, the shady man took off his shirt, hopped into a minivan, and left. But when the delivery driver, watching all of this, finally exited the truck and went inside the office, what he discovered was absolutely gruesome. Inside was the district manager lying in a pool of his own blood. Evidently, he had been stabbed several times. So immediately, the delivery driver called 911, but by the time they arrived, it was too late. The 36-year-old Thad Reynolds was dead. Based on the crime scene, he had put up a valiant fight, but it just wasn't enough. Additionally, there were two important physical findings that would become important later. One of these was a pair of sunglasses, and the other was an empty case for a hunting knife. But later on, when family and friends were notified about Thad's death, Michelle Reynolds wasn't acting the way you might think someone would upon hearing that their spouse was just brutally murdered. Pretty soon, several people, including Scott and Paige Harper, were checking on her at her house, and apparently she was strangely calm about the situation. One comment she made to a few people that were there was about a black dress that she had bought only 2 weeks prior. She said to them in a flat tone something to the extent of, "Whoever thought I'd be using it for this?" Around the same time as this, though, the police investigating the crime scene quickly started to come to the conclusion that Thad's murder was a pre-planned attack. This was simply because, had it been a robbery or something, things would have been taken from him like money or his wallet, but that wasn't the case. So as the investigation picked up speed, police started looking into who could have done this and why. Soon, they sent out a public request for anyone who had any leads in the case to come forward with their information. And quickly, one person did. His name was Scott Roberts, and he was one of Scott Harper's co-workers. According to Roberts, one day while he was at work, he overheard Scott Harper talking over the phone to someone in a very flirtatious, romantic way. He was able to hear the voice on the other line, and right away Roberts recognized that it wasn't Scott's wife, Paige, but instead a woman named Michelle. On top of this, Scott Harper was friends with Thad and drove a burgundy red minivan. So with that being the case, he found it safe to assume that Scott may have had some connection to the case. And as it turns out, the police agreed with this assessment. Following their interview with Roberts, they interviewed Scott Harper and began asking him some basic questions. And while he tried acting like he was just as stunned as everybody else about the murder, police couldn't help but notice a few things about Scott's physical appearance. For starters, he wasn't wearing his glasses, despite the fact that he required prescription lenses. And additionally, his hand was bandaged up as if he had been injured. But when police asked Scott about his hand, he claimed to have hurt himself at the gym. How convenient, right? Heck, even his wife Paige was starting to become skeptical about this story. So after the authorities were finished interviewing Scott, they soon acquired a warrant to search his work computer. Now, Scott worked at a hospital, and so much of the time he was using the internet, it was through his computer. And lo and behold, once they gained access to this, more and more layers of the onion began to get peeled back. Police uncovered a large collection of emails sent back and forth between Scott and Michelle Reynolds. And what these showed was basically a linear timeline of their relationship. The first several emails were about church-related things and usual sort of topics. But as the months passed, the emails became increasingly more and more intimate until ultimately a terrible discussion started taking place. So it's important to note that Michelle never explicitly told Scott to murder Thad. Instead, she tried to be less straightforward about it by saying things such as, "You'll have to live longer than Thad for us to be together because he'll never agree to divorce." And before long, Scott began looking up things on the internet about how to commit the perfect murder and details on the use of various poisons. Now, don't forget that the two people that were flirting with all of these discussions and topics were supposed to be devoted Christians, and as Michelle said earlier, on fire for God. Which, by the way, when she said this during the youth retreat, she was actually in the process of cheating on her husband with Scott. In fact, the two of them were even sharing the same hotel room that Michelle booked. Now, according to Paige, Scott's wife, she had noticed her husband get up and leave the room, but she didn't know where he went. But anyway, as soon as this ungodly affair began, it was only a matter of time before a specific date was set to get rid of Thad. One of the last emails sent between Michelle and Scott was Michelle sending Scott the exact detail of Thad's schedule on July 5th. This included information on where he worked and what time he would be there. And then the final email Scott sent to Michelle was him basically saying that if Michelle didn't want him to go through with it, to speak then or forever hold her peace. So Michelle replied back that she was okay with him going through with it. And July 5th of 2004 would be the day that it would happen. However, 4 days before the 5th, Michelle and Scott met up for lunch, and after making out for a bit in the parking lot, Michelle asked Scott if he had talked to Thad yet. It's not clear whether she was using coded language or if Scott was lying about this key detail. But regardless, after Scott told her he hadn't confronted Thad yet, Michelle started to grow distant towards him. So when July 5th rolled around, Scott was convinced that he had to act. Early in the morning of that day, he got out of bed, drove to the Frito Lay Distribution Center, and parked right outside of the building. Next, he exited his vehicle and went inside. Then, after making his way in, Thad looked up from where he was and asked him what he was doing there, to which Scott replied, "I want what you have." Afterwards, the two engaged in a bloody fight, with Scott being the only one who came out alive. In the process, he lost his glasses and dropped the hunting knife case. And when he was finished committing such an awful sin, he left as fast as he could. Only a few days later, Scott was interviewed by the police, and he was officially arrested on suspicion of murder. Meanwhile, the authorities had a bit of trouble finding something to arrest Michelle for, but before long, the emails she sent turned out to be enough. But the crazy part is that even when both of these petty lovers were arrested and awaiting their respective trials, they continued sending each other love letters for several weeks. And some of these letters sent by Michelle included Bible verses, which, to be honest with you, is just insane. But in the end, Scott hesitated to implicate Michelle in the murder, and it really seems like he was just genuinely that infatuated with her. Even so, by the time 4 years passed, each of their respective trials took place, and the outcome was as follows. For his part in the crime, Scott Harper took a plea deal and was sentenced to life in prison in return for Michelle not being given the death penalty. Meanwhile, for her part in the murder of her own husband, Michelle Reynolds was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Now, needless to say, the community's reaction to what happened to Thad Reynolds was one of complete and utter shock. How two people who claim to be so on fire for God would conspire together to commit murder was practically unbelievable, and naturally, the people they went to church with were the most surprised of all. To them, it seemed like Michelle and Scott were good, kind-hearted Christians. I mean, after all, Scott was literally a minister. But ultimately, none of that matters. When the cloud of puppy love takes the place of logic and reason. This is not the first case we've done where we've seen this type of thing happen, and unfortunately, it won't be the last either. Rest in peace to Thad Reynolds, a father of 4 and a good Christian. As for Michelle and Scott, good riddance. Because of their selfishness and cruelty, a bunch of kids had to grow up without their parents in their lives. And frankly, that's just unforgivable. But anyways, thank you for watching this episode of High Time Crime. If true crime is your thing, then please subscribe and hit the like button because that's all we do. I also have a second account with my brother named Horrifying where we tell stories about everything paranormal. This includes true crime, mysteries, and things that are just downright spooky. I'd greatly appreciate if you subscribed to that too. Another thing is that I've recently started an all-exclusive Patreon. Here, you're given the choice of 3 tiers, And the last one allows for a Patreon-only video that's uncensored. That tier and the second tier will both allow you to have your name at the end of each High Time Crime video. This is just in case you want to support me a little further. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care, friend.